My name is Bernie Dunker. I'm the Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Science, and it's my great honor and privilege to act as the moderator for tonight's talk. As you're probably aware, the Bridges series looks at the very fascinating connections between arts, mathematics, and science, and it's now in its 7th year here at St. Jerome's. It represents a really fantastic collaboration between St. Jerome's University and the faculties of Math, Arts, and Science at the University of Waterloo, as well as the Fields Institute. Tonight's topic is recursion, the loops that make the world go round. And we have 3 diverse and exciting speakers that are going to be looking at this from different angles and interacting with each other. I think you're in for a real treat. Personally, when I saw the title, I thought back to math class. Recursion was a vague term that I remembered, and I was fascinated to see the different speakers that were lined up for this evening, and I'm looking forward as much as you to hearing what they have to say and how they're going to interact with each other. So let me tell you, before things get underway, just a little bit about the 3 fantastic speakers we have tonight. Andrew DeMann is a specialist in fantasy, science fiction, and the comics medium. He's the 2017 winner of the Gabriel Roy Prize. He was a featured commentator expert in a 10-part documentary series on comics entitled Ink, Alter Egos Exposed, and is a past president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics. Andrew received his PhD from the University of Waterloo with comprehensive specialization in graphic narrative, semiotics, and discourse, and textual analysis. And you'll get an opportunity, if you like, to buy his recent book, The Margins of Comics, from the bookstore table at the reception following tonight's Bridges lecture. Josh Neufeld is someone I know very well. He's a colleague, professor of microbiology in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo. He received his BSc and MSc from McGill University. He then went on to do a PhD at UBC and then did postdoctoral studies at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Now, Josh uses a combination of molecular and cultivation techniques to study populations of microbes in terrestrial, aquatic, and host-associated environments with a view to isolating and exploiting the microbes that matter. And our third speaker tonight is Naomi Nishimura, who studied math and classics at Yale University before going on to obtain her master's and PhD at the University of Toronto in computer science. Her research focuses on algorithms and complexity with a specialization in parametrized algorithms and reconfiguration problems. She's taught recursion to students in many disciplines, both here at Waterloo and at the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, and to teachers that have been enrolled in the Masters of Mathematics for Teachers program, as well as to high school students and many other folks through the Center of Education in Mathematics and Computing's free online courseware. So with that, I'm going to make my way off the stage and turn it over to tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Bernie. So again, my name is Josh Neufeld, and I study microbial ecology. And I'm very excited to be speaking to you this evening about recursion because 2 years ago, I had never heard of recursion. In fact, my first exposure to the concept was visiting an undergraduate lecture by Troy Vasiga, who's in Sheraton School of Computer Science. Introductory lecture, all about recursion. I was just there for the lecture. And I walked away from that lecture amazed and confused. I was amazed because here, a concept I'd never heard of before, suddenly I realized that there were connections to my own discipline and other disciplines as well. And I thought that was really quite exciting. So that was where things started. And it didn't take me very long to find my colleagues to join around a Bridges lecture to explore how recursion unites a variety of disciplines in this way. Ideal for a Bridges lecture. At the same time, I mentioned I was confused. And I think it's worth pointing out that there were elements of recursion that I didn't fully understand. And I think that as a biologist, given that there were elements I couldn't understand, it's possible there may be some elements of recursion that won't be fully understandable this evening, and I thought that perhaps, just as we get started, I would give you a little working definition that you can carry with you through the lecture, and hopefully that'll help you a little bit with everything else we might explore on this topic. Part of the reason why I think it can be a little bit confusing is if you, like me, for the first time, want to learn more about recursion, the first thing you do is type it into Google and search for it. Well, if you do that, you're not going to be fully satisfied right away. What you're going to find is the very first hit on recursion is, did you mean recursion? And you can click on that, and you're going to be right back here again. You can keep doing that for infinity. It's Google's little Easter egg, and so it's perfect timing this time of year, so you're welcome. But also the definition that shows up first, also not that helpful. The repeated application of a recursive procedure or definition. You have to know more about recursion to know about recursion. Also not all that helpful, although accurate and quite clever. So what I'm going to do is leave you with an image and a definition, carry that with you through this evening. Hopefully that'll help you like it helped me. Here's the image that this typically helps me. This is a stout, and it's called the Drost effect. And what's clever about this particular beer is that the label of the beer has the image of the beer itself on it. And you know that inside of that image, there's going to be another image of a beer, and that'll keep going for infinity. And then the clever thing about the name of that beer, the Drost effect, where does that come from? Well, that's from a very early version of this type of replicating image, where the Drost cocoa has an image there. This is from 1904, this Dutch cocoa, where you can see the image of the package inside of the package, and there'll be another version and another version as far as resolution will take you. So that's a good visual representation of recursion. It works, and it goes well with the Wikipedia definition that helped me, which is the process of repeating items in a self-similar way. Kind of like you hold a mirror up in front and behind, and you can see a reflection repeated many, many times, smaller and smaller. So we tonight, us three speakers, are going to be playing with this concept, and specifically we're going to be playing with the items, repeating items. It can be an image, it can be a concept, it can be words, it can be numbers, computations, many different things can be repeated in self-similar ways. That's what we're going to be strictly and loosely working with the definition of recursion. So I hope that helps you. And as we connected as a team to talk about recursion, we met at the grad house close by. We had a beer as well, or at least the two of us did. Naomi does not drink beer, but we had a beer, and we talked. And the conversation went a little bit like this. Naomi mentioned that recursion has roots within mathematics and computer science and talked about how recursion is used there. Naomi's going to be first to tell, exactly like she did to us, what, from her perspective, how recursion works within computer science. Then I'm going to talk about biology or science and how recursion applies in my discipline. And then Andrew's going to take it outside of science fiction into science fiction and talk about how recursion applies within his discipline. Naomi's going to come back and bring us back to the applications of recursion within computer science. That was our conversation at the grad house, and we thought we would like to bring that conversation to you here this evening. And so if it helps, imagine yourself with a little chocolate stout beside you. Sit back and relax and enjoy. Naomi?
Josh's invitation to join in this adventure was one that I couldn't refuse. One was the obvious reason why wouldn't one want to form bridges to other disciplines, and the other reason was spinach. Spinach, because when I was a little girl, somehow I picked up on the schoolyard through the ether that I wasn't supposed to like spinach. I was supposed to be scared of it. It wasn't something I'd ever encountered, but I was frightened. Well, recursion is the spinach for incoming students to computer science. Something they don't know what it is, but they're scared of it. So I hope by the end of this evening, you will find that recursion is natural, beautiful, powerful, elegant, and doesn't get stuck in your teeth. And the pictures went away. There we go. Thank you. In fact, it is so natural that recursion appears in a book for children. If you've read this book, you might think about where recursion might occur. Think about in the background. So what I'd like to talk about now, though, is computer science. And computer science, if you want to summarize it in one sentence, it's about figuring out how to solve problems using computers. We want to do this to save time. We want to make things easier for us. So there are pros and cons to this. What are the pros? Let's start out positive. One of the advantages is that computers are never going to complain if you ask them to do lots and lots of boring tasks, and they'll do them quickly. That's great. And those computers, they'll do exactly what you ask. What's the downside? Well, computers can't read your mind. Right? That's kind of unfortunate. And as a consequence, they will do what you ask, not necessarily what you want them to do. So it's really important to make sure that computers have really precise instructions to follow. Now, unfortunately, writing precise instructions takes time. We wanted to have the computer to save time, but now this is taking our time. So in order to make it be advantageous to use computers, we want to find ways of writing things in a short and very clear way. So let me give you an example of that. Here's a slide with some numbers. And if you were talking to a computer, you might ask it how to figure out the biggest number on the slide. That's pretty easy here, right? I made it really big. And here's another example. Can you find the biggest number on this slide? You can probably describe that pretty easily. But now let's think about having any group of numbers, any number of numbers, and we want to be able to still give some very simple instructions on how to solve the problem. So here's an example of some numbers. How could we describe this in a simple way? Well, the biggest number is either the number 8 or it's the biggest of the rest of the numbers. How do we figure out the biggest of the rest of the numbers? That's the biggest number in a group of numbers. That's the same problem we're trying to solve, but with a different group of numbers. And we know how to solve that, right? We know it's either going to be the first number, namely 11, or the largest of the rest of the numbers. So I'm putting boxes around these to show you the next group of numbers we're looking at. And we can do this again, right? We now have a group of numbers. What's the largest number in that group? It's either the first number, 41, or largest. Sounding a little repetitive, right? Repetitive is good if it's supposed to be for a computer. So, again, either it's going to be 67 or the largest of the rest. We keep doing the same thing. And we finally get to a point where the rest of the numbers is just one number. Can we find the largest of one number? That's pretty easy, okay? And so I'm going to give this a blue box now to show we've actually solved this problem. So we can now use this solution in our previous problem, where we were trying to figure out what the largest was of 23 and the rest of the numbers. Well, that's going to be the largest of 23 and 7. We can figure that out. We've solved that problem. And now we can take this solution and we can use it to solve the previous problem, where I was finding the largest of the number in the blue box and the number before it, because that was the first in that group. So 67, still the largest, and finally we've solved the entire problem. Okay, I can see you're really excited by this. Why is this a good idea? Why would anybody do that? And the answer is, we're not trying to do it for people. We're talking about how we would talk to a computer. So the reason it's a good way to solve the problem is we can describe it in a really simple way, no matter what numbers we have. If we have more than one number, we can say it's either the first number or, can solve the problem on the rest of the numbers. And if there's just one number, then we know the answer. It's just that one number. Why does this work? There's something very special about a group of numbers that we're using, and that is that a group of numbers contains a smaller group of numbers within it. So if we're trying to solve a problem on a group of numbers, and we can find a smaller group of numbers, we can use the same way of solving the problem. I'm going to use this as a metaphor, this idea of a ladder, showing how we are able to climb up and down the ladder for various purposes. So when we were solving our problem, we were climbing down the ladder. We were on a rung that had a group of numbers, the largest group of numbers, and then when we went down a rung, we had a small group we were looking at. And we kept going down and down and down until we got to the bottom rung where we could solve the problem. We had just one number, and we call that the base case. So we'll be using that terminology a lot throughout our lecture, the idea of a base case where we get to the bottom of a ladder. Now, this ladder happened to start at the top of the slide, but you can think of this as going as far up into the sky as you like. There's no limit on how high this ladder can go. And this idea is something that we see elsewhere, not just that a group of numbers can have a smaller group of numbers within it, but with these nesting dolls, a doll can have a smaller doll within it, a smaller and smaller doll, and then you can find the base case. Right? That one over there. We also use this idea when we talk about, when we use collective nouns, such as when we talk about a school of fish. When we talk about a school of fish, we don't have a particular number of fish in mind. If a shark came and ate one of those fish, we'd still call it a school of fish. And if it ate another fish, we'd still call it a school of fish. So I can put these fish on a ladder, a fish ladder, and we can think about going down the ladder to get smaller and smaller schools of fish. And you might argue with me that one fish isn't a school of fish, it's just a lonely fish. But if we instead defined a school of fish to be 5 fish or 10 fish, we would have the same picture. It's just that the bottom rung would have a different number of fish there. So the ideas that we're using here is we can either think about climbing up a ladder, so we could start with one fish and add fish, or start with one number and make bigger and bigger groups, or we can think of the way we climbed down the ladder when we were solving the problem about the numbers. The climbing up you can think of as a way of propagating larger groups of fish, groups of numbers, and you can think of recursion, the process of climbing down, as being used for computation. We're going to make things simpler and a little bit fuzzy in our definitions. We're just going to use the terms recursion and recursive to refer to both of these concepts. So if we're somewhere on the ladder and we're climbing some way, this is what we're going to use. So is that what people are so excited about? Is that all there is? Well, there's a lot more. I would like to tell you about 2 ways we can extend this and have further connections to both biology and literature. So one way that we can extend this, if you think about that school of fish, well, we didn't have to think of it as being formed by just eating one fish and then having a school of fish left over. We could think about having 2 schools of fish joining or 3 schools of fish joining to form a bigger school of fish. So we could have something, a definition, a way of building things out of 2 or more smaller entities. The other thing we could do is we could have multiple entities, each of which have their own definition, that are defined in terms of each other. That may sound totally confusing. I'll give some examples in just a moment. So these are the 2 ways we're going to extend it. Let's first look at the first way. So as I said, we could have a school of fish built out of 2 schools of fish, or we could have a flock of birds built out of 2 flocks of birds, and each of those in turn out of 2 flocks of birds. This doesn't look like a ladder anymore, but it's again showing how we can construct from a base case, and here the bottom row are single birds. This again, if you're willing to consider one bird to be a flock. Same ideas with the school of fish. If we wanted to have a bigger number of birds, it would be the same structure, just different numbers of birds there. And this structure is, you will see it many times in this lecture. It's also very important in computer science. We call it a tree, even though the birds might not recognize it as a tree. And as Josh will take you through, it does conform to our view of a family tree. We do draw a family tree in that way. Now I'd like to tell you about ways of combining information from multiple things that are defined in recursive ways. So as a very simple example, we're going to look at positive, odd, and positive even numbers. So the base case for positive odd numbers is that lonely little 1 down at the bottom there. And now we're going to add a 2 to be our base case for even numbers. And now we can see that we can take an odd number and add 1 and get an even number. Or we can take an even number and add 1 and get an odd number. And we can keep doing this process. Oops, sorry. Doesn't look like a ladder anymore, but we have this interconnection between these two types of entities, and we can build bigger ones out of smaller ones. The second example I'd like to give is going to be a connection over to Andrew. So I'm going to just take 2 parts of speech in English. It's much more complicated than this, but let's look at noun phrases and prepositional phrases. So we are going to define these in terms of each other and show how we can build them up. So a noun phrase is just anything that behaves like a noun. So for example, the cat is a noun phrase and the hat is a noun phrase. A prepositional phrase is formed just by taking a preposition and gluing it onto a noun phrase. So we could take the preposition in and we glue it onto the hat, and there we have the prepositional phrase in the hat. You can probably see where I'm going with this. How can we form a noun phrase? Well, one of the ways of forming a noun phrase is by gluing together a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase. So we can take the noun phrase, the cat, glue on in the hat, and we end up with the cat in the hat. Now, it's even more interesting stuff.
So from there, we go into biology. And you might be tempted to think that biology should be unapologetically organic, certainly without patterns that are defined by recursion. But let me show you some patterns that are defined by recursion. And then I will try to argue that that's not where biology gets exciting when it interfaces with recursion. I'll take you to some other examples that I think are much more exciting than the patterns that you're about to see. The first pattern that you will see is this one here. And in the late 1990s, an Israeli biophysicist, Eshel Ben Jacob, isolated 2 new types of bacteria from soil. And these types of bacteria from soil have very large genomes, and they have the ability to communicate with chemical signaling in ways that you don't typically see in the types of bacteria we study frequently in the lab. What he found was that they made these kinds of patterns, and these patterns became art to him. And what he would do is inoculate the center of a Petri plate, so this is about 8 centimeters in diameter, and with these bacteria he had isolated. And what they would do is they'd go exploring for food. And the way they would do that was by creating vortexes of bacteria. So these yellow circles that you're seeing here, false colored, but that's where the densest zones of bacteria are that form these little swirling vortexes that are being propelled forward because they're repelled by the chemical signals coming from behind. So they're exploring their environment, and as they do so, they curve slightly, and as they do, they propagate new swirling vortexes of bacteria that go in seek of food. And they also propagate in different directions, and every single one of these swirling vortexes spawns new swirling vortexes to create what becomes a rather beautiful fractal pattern where you can fraction off individual components of it and have them resemble the larger components that they're connected to. So that's beautiful and visually appealing. And that's where I wanted to start as a microbiologist. Let's start with the bacteria. But let's move out now to there's also other important organisms in biology, and here's one. This is the sunflower. And the sunflower has an arrangement around the middle. All these are the seeds of the sunflower here. And it's also a very nice pattern. It's a very good use of real estate. And the reason why they occupy the real estate so efficiently is because of the spirals that they're forming. Spirals in either direction. And these are ever-widening spirals. They ever widen in a very specific, for many sunflowers anyway, they ever widen in a specific geometric formation that some of you may recognize as looking a little bit like that Fibonacci series, where the numbers define, in the Fibonacci series, the width of each subsequent section of the spiral. And the way you would calculate that is by recursion, where you are adding together the widths of the previous two sections. So 1 plus 1 is 2, and 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, and 5 plus 3 is 8, and so on. And so that becomes a logarithmic spiral that gets larger and larger the further it moves from the center. So that spiral allows for the seeds to be nice and closely packed within the flower, following the Fibonacci series, which is defined recursively. So that is the sunflower, but you can also see a very similar type of spiral forming within the nautilus shell itself. So this is the cephalopod family, so same as, what do you call those things? Squids and octopi. So they'll be in the same family, and these nautilus, what they will do is live within their shell until they get bigger, and then they will back out. So here's where it would be living here in a cross-section of the shell. This is when it was smaller, 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 smaller. And not only do you have that spiral shape, and we can pretend that it also follows the Fibonacci sequence, but what it's really doing, and I think this is maybe more interesting, is these chambers that it's left behind are all self-similar to one another, and they're repeating. So again, you see the recursion within the nautilus shell here with self-similar repeating structures that begin with a base case and then move outwards to the mature nautilus. So that's also quite nice. And you can also see humans engineering structures that kind of look very similar in overall structure when perceived from above. A staircase looks much the same way with a base case somewhere near the bottom and a climbing self-similar repeating structures to the top. At least visually, that's what it gives us. And that's not so different than other types of fractal patterns that you might be familiar with. And fractal patterns are a good example of recursion, repeating self-similar structures from a base case. So those are visually appealing for humans anyway, defined by recursion patterns. But that's a very superficial way of seeing biology and recursion interfacing. And I think I'd like to convince you that there's other ways that are far more fundamental to biology where you'd find recursion. 4 ways that I'll try to convince you of this evening. One is the language of life. The next will be the propagation of life. Then we'll talk about diversity of life, and then complexity of life. Sounds like a lot, but it'll be very quick. Just quick presentation of a few of these concepts as they overlap with recursion. So, Naomi mentioned already that it's possible to take base cases of language and propagate those out to develop meaning in many different ways by following a recursive definition, adding to grammar by defined rules. And Andrew's going to talk in more detail about that language and thought and how that can come together by following recursive definitions. I want to make a point here that biology is based on a language as well, a chemical language of DNA, and that will have its own grammar. You have different types, you have genes, you have regulatory elements. All of these need to come together in defined ways, following rules, and they need to be propagated appropriately to fill out a book, a genome of an organism. It doesn't mean that the genome is generated by recursion, but there are rules of the grammar that can apply, and with synthetic biology becoming increasingly commonplace, it is not at all surprising to think that these rules might matter for assembling genes into genomes for synthetic organisms. So there you have a little bit of recursion, fundamental to life in the very DNA that codes for all of us. That's one way. Let's get maybe to the fun way, the propagation of life. This I want to just appeal to the nesting doll example that Naomi mentioned already. Each one of us here this evening is here because we have a mother. Each of our mothers has a mother. Each of our mothers' mothers has a mother, all the way back. These nesting dolls here are physically possible to nest within each other in one place and one time. We can't do that, obviously. There's a little bit of a time separation there. We're temporally separated. But nonetheless, this is repeating self-similar structures all the way back. All the way back to what? Naomi mentioned that I should probably clarify here to avoid any confusion that you there, you here tonight, this is not you. You are not the base case. This can continue indefinitely. This is you over here. Okay, so us over here, what if we were to trace back as humans through an unbroken chain of descent? Where do we end up? What is the base case of life for us? Don't know if you've thought about that. And I can take you there. I can show you the base case for us. And in doing so, I'm going to have to show you a tree. And it's going to look a lot like the family tree that Naomi already showed you. But I need you to turn it over so that you put the older members, the base cases, or the base case, at the bottom. And then the terminal nodes are going to be at the top, so you're at the top. That's how we're orienting within the tree now. So let's go back in time, and I'm going to let Professor Simpson explain to you where we've come from here in a little bit of detail from 1993, so a little bit dated. But let's follow me back. So here's me as modern man example, pretty accurate. Back to my ancestor, Homo erectus, through Fred Flintstone, King Kong's great-great-great-grandfather, monkeys, and I can't believe, as a biologist, I am showing you that we are descended from monkeys. We are not descended from monkeys. This is a joke tree. But I need to use it to get you past monkeys to the only accurate thing in this tree, which is the simple one-celled forms. Well, that's accurate, but also perhaps accurate that sponges with scrubber surface backing is one of the pinnacles of evolution. But otherwise, it's this. Somewhere in here lies the base case for us. So what is this simple one-cell life form that would represent the base case of humans? What would it look like? I can introduce you to it. It has a name as well. It's called the last universal common ancestor, also known as Luca. And so Luca would be the base case for all life. And arguably, there was only one. It's amazing to think. But one Luca for everything. So what would Luca be like? Well, it would be self-similar. It would be similar to us. And it would be similar in the following ways. It would be, as we now know from the physiology and habitat, it would be membrane-bound. So our cells were membrane-bound. So would Luca. It would also be using ATP as its chemical energy, exactly the same. Luca also would have had the ability to take DNA to RNA to protein. This is the central dogma of biology. That would have been established within Luca as well. But it would have been very different from there on forward. It would have been eating CO2, which we no longer do directly. It would be fixing nitrogen for itself. That's useful, which we've lost. It would also be anaerobic, oxygen would kill it, and it would also be a thermophile, so really high temperature. So that's why hydrothermal vents are often suggested as a good place for life to begin, because hydrothermal vents would be compatible with these kinds of features. So likely a high temperature loving organism. That's our base case. There would have been many base cases at the time. You've got to think back billions of years, and there would have been many base cases, all of which were spectacular failures, but there was one that resulted in all of us. So our base case is the same as a fungus's base case, same as a plant's base case, all the same base case. It could have been that this process of propagating by recursive definition to today through self-similar repeating structures, it could be that the end product would look identical to the initial. We could still be just like Luca, and we could be dead right now, actually, because oxygen in the room is not good, too cold, and so on. But something happened to make for slight changes in the process. So it's no longer the same. In fact, we look really, really different than our base case. So what happened? So propagation of life, diversification of life. And that's what Charles Darwin is renowned for, recognizing that there's similarity between all organisms, but there's also differences. And I'm going to give you just a spoiler alert here, in case you haven't read it. But what he was the first to observe was, or at least one of the first to document and so on, and this is straight out of his notebook here, that if you're starting off with organism 1, then it follows that organisms A, B, C, and D are all connected to each other, but there's not a complete spectrum of diversity all between. There's individual species. So there's two things going on. One is there's changes to the DNA. It's an error-prone process, and thankfully so. We can be here this evening to talk about it. But there's also selection, and that process of evolution requires the selection to remove the in-betweens. So that's what's happening, and mainly, I hope it's not lost on you, you're looking at a tree. You have 1 becomes 2, and 1 becomes 2, and 1 becomes 2. So fundamentally recursive. That tree is recursive. This tree is recursive as well. So here we have, this is sort of a cartoonized version of the tree of life where you can kind of come towards the center here to 4 billion years ago, and you move out in time as you move out towards the terminal nodes at the outside. So a tree like this is a nice way of showing what you can see here. Looks a little bit like fractal patterns where you can pull out sections of it. Again, recursively defined, fundamentally so. But you have humans over at the far right side here, and at the over at the far left, you're curling into the center. There's our base case, Luca, way at the beginning. Last universal common ancestor. So that's the diversification of life, bioevolution, natural selection. So there's now 3 layers of recursion here. We've got the language of life, DNA, with its grammar. You have the propagation of life through self-similar structures, but then you also have the diversification of life. 1 becomes 2, 1 becomes 2. You can draw it as a tree. But what about the complexity of life? There's a lot of things that we can see by eye, from birds to insects and so on. What about this complexity? Why are we not still bacteria and archaea, all these single-celled microorganisms still? What happened? That, you can imagine, is also linked to recursion as I see it. This is, again, a cartoonized tree, base case at the bottom, Luca down here, bacteria, archaea, and this is all us, the eukaryotes with the nucleuses, all the things that we know and recognize well. And these lines right here are where the funny business happened twice. Twice in the history of life as we know it, there was some funny business. And so what happened for that funny business, the first one down here below, is one organism somewhere along the path figured out that it does a lot better off when it engulfs another organism. So that's called endosymbiosis, living together. Happens, but it only happened once for all of us. So this thing inside, the smaller version, that's called the mitochondria now. It generates our energy. That was useful because the moment when that went inside, now this membrane can be used for many other things. No longer for energy generation, making ATP. That's taken care of by the one inside. The outside can be connected to other cells, can communicate, can get larger, and you can end up getting far more complex structures when you've done that. That's clever. And then other organisms became really clever and added a second one in there. It's called the chloroplast. And so now we have plants. Also pretty smart. Now there's a couple of base cases inside of a larger self-similar structure. It's not too dissimilar to what we have on the table in front of us. You look at your cell, here's your nucleus, here's the mitochondria inside. They look like bacteria, they divide like bacteria, they have their own little genomes. There's their history. And so you get little base cases inside of a larger self-similar structure. So that's us and our origins of complexity itself. Oh yeah, our base cases, here's mitochondria, looks like bacteria, and here's chloroplasts inside of plants. Plants have both. So this is what a tree of life looks like now. This is probably a more accurate way to draw the tree where you have bacteria over on the left, you have archaea, also microorganisms over on the right, and then you have the funny business which kind of breaks the rules of phylogeny. Drawing trees should not be done this way, but you connect it across the top because there's a merger, and you do that with the chloroplast to get the plants as well. So this is kind of a more recent tree of life, but you really want to see a recent tree of life. As a microbiologist, I gotta show it. The new view of the tree of life, which collapses all of these down into their appropriate diversity space. Just look at the genomes and their diversity. And that's what Laura Hug, who's now in our department here at the University of Waterloo, demonstrated by taking genomes of the diversity of, across the diversity of life. This is what our tree looks like now. The bacteria are all here at the top. The archaea are down here at the bottom. We're in the green with everything else you can see. All the macroorganisms, all the ones that are smart enough to have engulfed something else, to have that kind of complexity, that's just all here at the bottom in the green. So that's why, as microbiologists, we get excited about microbial diversity and talk about it, but that's another story for another day. Let's come back to recursion. And so I should just summarize by saying that I think recursion's very important for biology, not only because it's part of the language, the building of the language of the DNA itself, also because the propagation follows recursion, diversification into trees, one becomes two, nice fractal patterns, complexity of life through endosymbiosis, one inside of the other, and they also make sometimes some very pretty structures by defining those patterns recursively. So let's just say, perhaps, that within biology, you have recursion within recursion within recursion within recursion within recursion. I hope those links are strong enough for you to see the value of seeing recursion within the context of biology. And what I'm going to do now is let this be the end of science within the context of recursion, and we'll move on to science fiction for recursion. And this is not another one of those recursion tricks. He's a different person than me. This is Andrew DeMann. Okay, thanks.
So when I was asked to join this project, I was absolutely ecstatic because I've been teaching science fiction here for 13 years now. And when you teach science fiction for 13 years, you actually start to think of yourself as a scientist. So working with Josh and Naomi was humbling in both the good way and the really frustrating, diseasing way. And seeing just how far I had to go. First, so we'll start with syntactic recursion. This is a notion in language that essentially, by the rules of English grammar, it's actually perfectly okay for a sentence to go on. Now, if you tried to do this in essay format, your instructor would write run-on sentence. And you get in trouble for it. But you can actually go back to them and say, you're wrong, this is okay. English grammar says nothing about this. Now, where we do see this come up frequently is for anyone who has children at home, and they've had a day at school, and you ask them to describe their day to you. And they will run off something along these lines. First, we went to the candy store, and I wanted jujubes, but Caleb wanted gummy bears, and we didn't have enough money for both. But we thought that if we pooled our money, we could afford to get the gobstoppers. But Caleb only likes the red gobstoppers. And I'm not going to just eat the green gobstoppers, so we had to be funny. And we were both sad. But later that day, I went out to him at recess, and I said I was sorry. So we decided to play together anyway, and maybe go back to the candy store later that day. And if you want, absolutely forever. And again, that's okay. That's actually how the English language was designed to work. Now, the English language is a symbolic language. What that means is intelligibility is based upon agreement. So, very simply put, in order for you to understand a sign, you have to experience it at some level. So, the first time you ever saw a red sign with the word stop written in it, someone said, that's a stop sign. You stop your car on the line when you see this. The next time you saw it, you moved. But in English, you should note that we have vocabulary, which means that, again, you understand what it means. But still, I can run off a sentence right now, if I wanted to, pretty easily, that has never been uttered in the history of the English language. And you will still understand it perfectly, instantly. And that is what recursion gives the English language. Again, infinite variability, infinite complexity, and broad understanding. This is really important for the different ways that we're able to communicate with each other. This is Noam Chomsky and his team's view of recursion. What Chomsky was specifically trying to articulate is that recursion is a really, really human thing, specifically. So he says the following. We submit that a distinction should be made between the faculty of language in the broad sense, which they call FLN, broad, and in the narrow sense, FLN, for narrow. FLB includes a sensory motory system, a conceptual intentional system, and the computational mechanisms for recursion, providing the capacity to generate an infinite range of expressions from a finite set of elements. Again, genius aspect of the English language. And more interesting matter is their finding we hypothesized that FLN only includes recursion and is the only uniquely human component of the faculty. Meaning, again, that recursion is something that only humans have in their language. Everything else has all the other stuff. Every animal on this planet. But humans have recursion, and that's what gives us the big communication edge. My microphone is on mute. No worries. Naomi and I had a bet that we'd mess up the microphone first.
Hear me? Okay, thank you. Perfect. Sorry about that. So the idea was that, again, this is a uniquely human component of language. That's cool. That's a finding that's limited to the sphere of communications, which is obviously an interesting sphere. But Chomsky actually goes further with this. Here's a quote on Chomsky's work from Michael Corballis. Noam Chomsky has argued that human thought is generated by a merge operation applied recursively. That is, units are merged to form larger entities, and the merged entities can be themselves merged to form still larger entities, and so on. This operation underlies the embedded structure of human language. Now, for Chomsky, what this means, and this is a huge part of Chomsky's entire career, essentially, that what we can say very much defines what we are literally capable of thinking. And there are lots of fun examples of this coming out in our culture right now. You may have heard the pop culture argument that the Greeks constantly refer to the sea as the wine-dark sea because they literally didn't have the word blue yet. And as a result of that, they could not see the color blue. Without the word, they couldn't conceptualize it. That's a theory. It hasn't actually been proven, but it's been bandied around a lot by linguists and very much supports Chomsky's notion. So the recursive element of language thus becomes the recursive element of human thought. And what you are able to literally conceive of, if true, is once again based upon this concept of recursion. So as a building block towards science fiction, what we're talking about here is the recursive nature of language itself and its effect upon thought. Now we go a little bit further, a little bit narrower to some degree as well. Recursion is a particularly strong component of science fiction literature. Science fiction combines language and thought, so obviously it has that recursion built into it, as any genre was. But there's actually a specific relationship between science fiction and humanity, society, civilization, however we want to frame it, that is more interestingly recursive than in other genres. Now, Darko Suvin talks about this extensively. For Suvin, what makes science fiction unique or special is the concept of the novum, literally translated the new. So in this particular argument, the way it works is we have a base case, coming back to what Josh and Naomi were talking about, which is reality. And a science fiction author can come and look at reality, and then they introduce a novum. So the story is our world, but with something new. And what that is doesn't really matter, except for the purposes of storytelling. It can be an alien life form. It can be an artificial intelligence. It can be a Terminator. It does not matter. It's something new introduced into the base reality. But science fiction, again, has this particular focus on technology and is frequently cited as the technological imagination for our culture itself. The notion being that a lot of the things that we've created in the last 200 years have been things that were actually kind of created in science fiction first, or at least devised within science fiction. If you ask Robert Goddard where he got the idea for rocket science, it's not because he had a mathematical, ingenious sort of a moment of dawning reality. What it is he read War of the Worlds. And he'll flat out tell you that. How did the aliens get from Mars to Earth in War of the Worlds? Well, based on what Wells is saying, it kind of sounds like rocket propulsion. Cool, I will build that. And thus we get a situation where, again, we take an inductive step. So base case, you get a novum, and now the next science fiction author is writing about a world that actually does have rocket science. And then the next science fiction author will possibly be writing about a world that actually does have the latest novum that some scientist created. And the cruel reality of this, of course, is that H.G. Wells doesn't get a cut of rocket science. He doesn't get listed on any sort of patents or anything like that. But arguably, H.G. Wells invented rocket science before Robert Goddard did. Science fiction as imagination, science fiction as conceptualization of things that we later build into our reality. This is the way we like to talk about the novum, and again shows that kind of recursive element that I wouldn't say is fully unique to science fiction, but definitely seems to be much more prominent in science fiction, just based upon, again, its relationship to our reality. So we can't cover the entire history of science fiction tonight, which would be awesome, but we don't have time for that. What we can do is isolate a specific story and see how it works with this theory that we're advancing. So the story we're going to look at is called The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. It has two important things going for it. One, it is considered by many to be the finest science fiction short story ever written. And two, it's all about recursion in some really kind of cool and dynamic ways. Asimov himself considers this the best thing that he ever wrote. And for the record, Isaac Asimov wrote a lot of things. He holds the record. He is the only author to ever be published in every single category of the Dewey Decimal System. That is not easily achieved. It would be an understatement to call him prolific. The man is so smart that when Trivial Pursuit wanted to create a rival, the competitors of Trivial Pursuit wanted to create a rival board game to Trivial Pursuit, they went to Isaac Asimov, they got him to sign off, and it's called Isaac Asimov Super Quiz, and you can find it in thrift stores all over the place. Here's what Asimov says about his own story, which came out in 1956, first published in Science Fiction Quarterly. This is by far my favorite story of all those that I have written. After all, I undertook to tell several trillion years of human history in the space of a short story, and I leave it to you as to how well I succeeded. I also undertook another task, but I won't tell you what that was, lest I spoil the story for you. He's being very considerate in not spoiling the story for his audience. I am not that considerate. And in order to discuss this story, I'm going to absolutely ruin it for you. But that'll be kind of in the name of science. Okay, so the basic premise of the story, and then I'll read you the end, is appropriate to our talk tonight, which started over beer. A couple scientists are hanging out with the most advanced computer in the world, and they get drunk. And in their drunkenness, they dare each other to ask the computer a really big question. Can universal entropy be reversed? Which is to say, can we stop the heat death of the universe? Eventually, all the stars burn out. Is there any way to avoid that hard ending on reality? And the computer immediately comes back, insufficient data to provide a meaningful response. But the computer keeps evolving, almost recursively. And 1,000 years later, another family asks it the same question, and the computer responds, insufficient data. And this goes on for millennia, again and again and again, insufficient data for an actual response. And then we get to the ending here, which again, we'll just have quiet reading time. The stars and galaxies died and snuffed out, and space grew black after 10 trillion years of running down. One by one, man fused with AC, which is the name of the computer. Each physical body losing its mental identity in a manner that was somehow not a loss but a gain. Man's last mind paused before fusion, looking over a space that included nothing but the dregs of one last dark star and nothing besides but incredibly thin matter, agitated randomly by the tag ends of heat wearing out asymptotically to the absolute zero. Man said, AC, is this the end? Can this chaos not be reversed into the universe once more? Can that not be done? AC said, there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer. Man's last mind fused and only AC existed, and that in hyperspace. Matter and energy had ended, and with it space and time. Even AC existed only for the sake of the one last question that it had never answered from the time a half-drunken computer 10 trillion years before had asked the question of a computer that was to AC far less than was a man to man. All other questions had been answered, and until this last question was answered also, AC might not release his consciousness. All collected data had come to a final end. Nothing was left to be collected. But all collected data had yet to be completely correlated and put together in all possible relationships. A timeless interval was spent in doing that. And we can think about Naomi's description of how computers are really good at doing boring things for a long period of time. And it came to pass that AC learned how to reverse the direction of entropy. But there was now no man to whom AC might give the answer of the last question. No matter. The answer by demonstration would take care of that too. For another timeless interval, AC thought how best to do this. Carefully, AC organized the program. The consciousness of AC encompassed all of what had once been a universe and brooded over what was now chaos. Step by step, it must be done. And AC said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And thus ends one of the most famous science fiction short stories of all time, essentially advancing the theory of a recursive universe, in which you eventually build towards simulation, and a new universe starts within that simulation, which will eventually build towards simulation, on and on and on. So here we have a cool kind of story suggesting the notion of recursion again in a recursive language, again from a recursive consciousness, and all of those other elements. Now, coming back to what we were talking about before, the idea of the novum as a new thing on reality. The catch with the novum is that it always seems fantastic or improbable while it's still a novum, until it gets merged into reality and becomes something that we're familiar with. Smartphones don't blow our minds anymore. The internet doesn't blow our minds anymore. But for the science fiction authors who first envisioned those things, that was mind-blowing, and they passed on that sort of blown-mindedness to their audience. Now, if we look at recent findings in physics, we can see that Asimov's suggestion isn't actually that insane. There has been a lot of traction surrounding the theory that reality is in fact a simulation, a two-dimensional projection of three-dimensional space. The notion that we are all, to some degree, living in a virtual reality, exactly as Asimov kind of postulated with the last question. To give you an example of traction, let's talk about some contemporary engineering and an astrophysicist, I guess. Rock stars, I think we could probably call these guys. So at the appropriately named 2016 Isaac Asimov Memorial Debate, Neil deGrasse Tyson argued that the likelihood that we are living in a virtual reality, quote, may be very high, citing the theory that virtual reality is the destiny of any advanced civilization, and the probability that we are the base case is therefore very low. So if every civilization is destined towards a virtual reality, then chances are this has been going on for a long time. Which one are we? Which inductive step represents us? Are we the base case? Are we vain enough to believe that? To hold on to that notion? Elon Musk, doing a lot of really cool things in the news lately, takes the exact same argument, suggesting more specifically that the mathematical likelihood that we are the original reality is 1 in billions. And again, this is a heady notion. This is an insane notion to a lot of people. But it's actually not that new. The novum element isn't entirely radical. If you allow for the fact that the majority of people on this planet already believe that this isn't real, that what we are in is a sort of simulation. The vast majority of world religions posit exactly that, meaning a large portion of the human beings on this planet already believe that what we are in is not reality. And thus this theory is actually, I would argue, extremely compatible with most world religions. Again, suggesting that what we're working with is potentially recursive in nature. So what I'm talking about here is a recursive language created by recursive beings in a recursive genre being used to talk about the recursive nature of reality itself. It's a cool, again, kind of heavy concept. It's also very abstract. This is why the arts major is doing this particular portion of the talk, as you might imagine. But hopefully we can bring it back down to earth a little bit with Naomi coming back up and talking to you a little bit about computation.
Now that we've been to other worlds, you might have some burning questions about this world, such as, what does this have to do with computer science? And what about that recursion in the Cat in the Hat? Spoiler alert, if you want to read the book and don't want to know what's going on, just plug your ears. So, the children have been playing, the cat and the cat has come to visit, the house is a total mess, mom is coming home, and something needs to be done. So we need a recursion, right? But we need to be working down to the base case because we want to do not propagation. We already propagated the mess. We need to have a problem solved through computation. So what do? Well, the cat in the hat takes off his hat, and under his hat is little cat A. Little cat A, of course, has a hat. He takes off his hat, and underneath that is little cat B. And underneath little cat B's hat is little cat C. This continues until we get to little cat Z. Little cat Z takes off his hat, and what's under his hat? The base case, voom, which cleans everything up and solves the problem. So this isn't going to be quite as exciting as that, but this does relate more to computer science. So how does this relate back to solving problems? Let's look at a very simple kind of problem that a calculator could solve, where we have a mathematical expression, and we want to figure out what the value of the expression is. So we're going to go up the ladder, we're going to be defining an expression using recursion, and then we're going to come back down the ladder to solve the problem and see how that generalizes. So a mathematical expression in its base case is just a number. If we want to build a bigger expression out of smaller expressions, we could add two of them together. We could put parentheses around an expression. We could multiply them together. We'll just keep them very simple for the moment. This is how we're going to make the expressions. And we don't have to always start with base cases. We can take any mathematical expression and build a bigger one using addition, multiplication, and parentheses. And we can just keep building in this way. Okay? So I want to relate this back to the notions of trees and grammars, which you saw throughout Josh and Andrew's talks. It also relates back in computer science. So I'm going to build us a nice tree here showing how we can build an expression. I'm going to use the letters E and F to show that we have a mathematical expression. We know a mathematical expression can be formed out of two mathematical expressions being multiplied. I'm using F to be another expression. So we also can take one of those expressions and say, well, we could form one by putting parentheses around it, by adding it together. And we also have these base cases. We can take an expression and assign it to a number and do the same with the rest. And at this point, everything is base cases. And if we read it all off, we have a whole expression that we've formed from a tree. Now, we can use the same idea. This was the definition part, or climbing up the ladder part. Now we're going to climb down the ladder by figuring out what the value of this expression is. So we can assign to each expression a number, and it's easy if it's a base case itself. That expression was a 5. This is worth 6. This is worth 2. Now it gets slightly more interesting. If we're adding two expressions, the value is going to be the sum of those values, so we get an 8 there. Parentheses don't change anything, so we still have our 8, and now we can multiply. So, how does this generalize? Well, anything that we can build up in this way and solve in this way, we can think of it in a recursive way. In particular, a program written for a computer can be generated in this same kind of way. That's our climbing up the ladder. And climbing down the ladder, we can run that program. We can make it actually come up with a value. The same process is true for creating a web page. A web page is constructed as a tree, and you can do some computations, making updates, or whatever you want to that web page. So that leads us to the following question. Can computers then solve every problem? That's a pretty stupid question. There are a lot of computers and a lot of problems that haven't been solved, so that's obviously no. But let's make it a little bit more precise. We've been talking about recursive definitions. If we have a recursive definition, then are we able to have a computer solve the problem? Let's be a little careful here. What do I mean by solving a problem? And what do I mean by information with recursive definition? So we talked about computer programs, grammars. Here are two problems from biology, which Josh gave to me, and pictures he gave to me. So sequence alignment, we talked about how there's a language of DNA, and you can have these languages compared to each other. You have sequences that you want to compare. So this is a problem you might solve on something that has a recursive definition. Another is forming an evolutionary tree. So you want to figure out what were the common ancestors, how did evolution occur? This, again, is something that has this recursive nature. So, can we solve these problems? What do we mean by solve? And here what I mean is, remember, we want to have a simple set of instructions. We don't want to have one set of instructions if it's one piece of information and another set of instructions for another piece of information. We want to have a set of instructions that works for all of the information. That would be a nice way of solving the problem. So that's the question we want to ask. Can we write some instructions that will work? And what does work mean? Here, we want to always get the correct answer, and we don't have to wait forever. And it's a pretty reasonable request. And unfortunately, this is both close to the end of the talk, and it's almost like the beginning of another talk, because even some very simple things, you want to have a computer program, you know it can be defined in this nice way up the ladder, and you want to ask, will this computer program ever stop running? And I don't mean will the computer break or if there's a power outage, but if it could keep going, as long as it wanted to, would it ever stop? We can't solve that problem. In the same sense, the sense of solve that I mentioned. Very simple question about grammar. So if you think about a grammar generating a language, propagating information, if we have two different sets of rules and we want to know, are all the same pieces of information generated? We can't solve that problem either. The problems that Josh mentioned, the sequence alignment problem, the phylogenetic tree, those are hard problems. They're not impossible in this sense, but it goes to some very interesting problem-solving techniques that would be part of another lecture. And also would be part of another lecture are connections. Noam Chomsky is very important in computer science as well. So unfortunately, we're going to have to tie things up here, and I'm going to leave that to the man with the words.
So what we've looked at tonight is math, biology, literature. We've been talking about a computational process. We've been talking about the building blocks of life itself. And we've been talking about the fantastic and wonderful ways in which we engage with the very concept of reality. Recursion can be found in all of these things, and I think it's very reasonable to assume that there can be found in a great deal more as well that we didn't have a chance to talk about. Ultimately, this is what recursion is. It's a process that spans every possible field imaginable to some degree. Truly, essentially, the loops that make the world go round. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thanks to Naomi, Josh, and Andrew, our wonderful speakers, or maybe they're virtual speakers at this virtual lecture tonight, for doing an amazing job. I came into this, as I said, with very kind of fuzzy memory of maybe hearing about recursion once in a math class. You've replaced that in my mind with all these amazing concepts, examples, images. I totally feel like I have to go back and read more Dr. Seuss now. So that was amazing. And I'm sure a lot of ideas and questions are swirling around in the audience's mind. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about questions. We're going to have our Q&A very shortly. While you're thinking about your questions, just going to tell you a little bit about the other lecture series that go on here at St. Jerome's. And there's a very special lecture, an amazing lecture coming up Friday, April the 13th at 7:30 p.m. in the Lectures in Catholic Experience. And the very special guest lecturer is Sister Helen Préjean, who's going to be presenting Dead Man Walking, The Journey Continues. Sister Préjean is the author of Dead Man Walking and The Death of Innocence. And we'll talk about her long-time involvement with the Ministry Against the Death Penalty, A ministry that believes in the dignity of all people, expresses mercy and justice by standing side by side with death row inmates and supports victims' family. And some of you probably remember the movie too. That was a movie that affected me a lot when I saw it, actually, Dead Man Walking. It was an amazing movie. Both the St. Jerome's University Reading Series and Medieval Studies Lecture Series are done now for the year, but watch for details about these and other lecture series by checking out the St. Jerome's University website. You can find out all the info, and for this upcoming lecture with Sister Préjean, you can register for that if you go to the St. Jerome's website. So now we're going to get into the Q&A session, and just a few notes about this session. This presentation, this lecture, is being live streamed. It's also being recorded. So please make sure that if you have a question, put up your hand. We have one, I think, microphone runner. We just have one microphone, so it might take a few minutes to get to you. And please wait until you have the microphone before you pose your question. Okay, so do we have our microphone runner ready? At the ready? Okay, great. All right, so any questions, raise your hands. And okay, there's one right up there. Going to make the microphone runner run up the stairs to the right and the upper right.
You're welcome.
Am I on? So I have a question about the biology section. You were talking about Luca, and you had all of these properties that it was anaerobic and had to be thermophilic and stuff. How do we know those things?
The paper that you were looking at there's a few ways in which we know all that stuff. One way is by taking, as that paper did, all known proteins and genes that encode them, and looking to see which one of those genes can you find in both main branches of the tree of life, in the bacteria and the archaea, at least two major domains across those two, and probably more. And then asking the question, of those, when you make one of those sequence alignments that Naomi mentioned there, which ones are consistently separating? So the archaea ones are always in the archaea, the bacteria ones are always in the bacteria, and it's important to ask that because they trade. There's a lot of transfer of DNA, and the microbes will still do it today. So you want to look for pure signal that hasn't been contaminated by transfer over. When you find that smaller set of genes, you look at those ones as your probable originating with that last universal common ancestor. There's only a few hundred. And when you get to that few hundred, it defines exactly which carbon fixation pathway is involved for that organism. It tells you that they can replicate their DNA. It tells you a number of features about that organism. And it happens to be the features that you most likely find associated with hydrothermal vents. The iron oxidation, the metal oxidation for energy, that kind of thing is sort of not surprising. It's what you would expect. So I think that's probably the best description of what that particular paper did, but it's kind of a fun process, and it's kind of neat that it works, and it consistently points to the same type of metabolism originally. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Is there some kind of name for a special recursive process like Markov chains that converge?
Oh no.
Well, you feed the results in again and again, and sooner or later you come out to a stasis.
That's a good question. Someone in the audience might know. I don't know the answer to that.
Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. It's a very good question. Sorry.
The recursive properties in the English language that you were talking about found in most other languages as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost universal. Sorry, that's a short answer.
Yeah. In English at one point. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Chomsky conjectured that there would be the humans are the only one that have recursivity in their language. Is that it's many years later now? Do we know if there are other organisms that have recursivity in their language?
Nothing's really come out that I've read talking about this. I mean, Chomsky's work is still being verified in like every aspect of language. We barely have the technology to prove some of his core theories, especially the way that the brain responds to language. Like the best we have is MRI, which is everyone knows is actually not that spectacular at giving us strong results. In terms of like zoological studies or anything like that to see if FLN does actually occur amongst animals, nothing yet that I'm aware of. That'd be cool. Maybe dolphins have it too. They're just not telling us.
The mitochondria's genetic code is encoded within the DNA. How is it passed on to each generation?
Very nice. They divide like bacteria, and the timing of that division and separation is coordinated. And another interesting aspect is their genome. If you look at the DNA of that genome, it's really small. There's not much left there. And if you look for where did the rest of that genome go, you find some of it in the rest of the genome of the host, the organism like us. Some of it's there. Some of it's just gone, not needed anymore. The only things that remain are the ability to make more of itself, to make the energy that it makes. That's what's left within the cell, either in its genome or in the host genome as well. But it's dividing just like bacteria, but it times it well. And if you need more mitochondria, they make more mitochondria.
Are there any single-celled organisms where they have something in them and then there's a thing in that thing?
Say it one more time.
Okay, so where in civets you have this cell and then there's the mitochondria. There's a cell, then there's a little cell in the cell, and then there's a mitochondria-like thing in that cell.
Oh, I see. Even smaller. Oh, that's a good question. I will answer it this way. I will say two things that just for interest's sake that's related. One is that there are some organisms that you'd think should have mitochondria, but they don't. So that's sort of the absence instead of another one. They probably did. There's some evidence that they used to have it and have lost it. So it looks like all of the eukaryotic life with the nucleus and so on probably at some point had mitochondria. That's how it originated. And then maybe, although I would say no, I don't think anyone knows of something even smaller inside of the mitochondria. The mitochondria is one example. We also have Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus itself. We haven't quite figured out how those things originated, and it may be another story of funny business that we'll tell at some point in the future. So we don't know what else has happened in the cell.
What I meant was basically an eukaryotic cell, the getting basically eaten by another cell, kind of.
So cells engulf other cells. There are certain types of cells that will engulf other cells and use them and do that for a while, and it won't last. But when it lasts, it's only a couple of examples that we know of where it's lasted long term.
Yes.
I just wanted to answer that previous question. I just finally remembered the terminology. If you take a function, apply it to an argument, take the result, apply the same function to that over and over again, recursively, I guess, it's a repeated process. If you finally end up with the same number coming out over and over again, that's called the fixed point of a function.
More questions for speakers?
Far side.
Yeah.
Someone over here has to think of a question now.
So my question, it came up when I was listening to the part on computer science and capabilities of computers, but I suppose it applies broadly to all of these areas. And I'm wondering if there is any kind of known relationship between the physical capabilities of computers, of the limits of language, or of a biological organism that limit or modify these recursive patterns in any way, or if it's just recursion will apply at any scale. Is there kind of a recursive sequence that is based on those kind of limitations to a recursive function in and of itself?
Oh no. Go on.
Okay. So the limitations which I talked about in terms of problems to be able to solve really are not tied to a particular physical computer. It's more the concept of computation. So in that sense, it's totally freed of reality.
I just had a question that in AI, the process of self-learning, is there like a procedure or a process similar to recursion that works there or no?
Could you repeat what in AI?
The process of self-learning in artificial intelligence, does that have a process or procedure of recursion within it or no?
Self-learning. So recursion is at the heart of so many things within computer science because so much is defined recursively. So this is part of the distinction that we're making and what we're talking about. We're using recursion in a loose way to talk about how things are generated. But as a computational process, it really only tends to work for things that are very simple without the novum, without any mutation. And so they're for a lot of problems that we solve. So when Josh was researching things on sequence alignment, for example, he found that there were some solutions that used recursion. And when we looked at it, a lot of those are just for simple cases. So to answer your question, yes, recursion can be used in part, but most of these really hard problems cannot be solved by recursion alone. They don't have that nice structure because we can't figure out what that structure is. Unlike in that example of the group of numbers where you can just see exactly what the smaller group is, when you have something complex like a grammar, or you're looking at DNA, you don't know where it came from. And so that's where it gets difficult.
Thank you.
Another question in a different way. Do we need recursion? Suppose there were no recursion, what do we lose?
So so recursion a lot of problems that can be solved in a repeated sort of way. So we're talking about computers for a computer, I assume, right? I don't know about, you can answer that separately. Recursion is just a nice way of explaining computation when the structure has that nice form. But there are other ways of describing computation. There's iteration, so you just do something repeatedly. That's a more general way of trying to solve a problem, even when you don't have that nice structure. So when students don't want to avoid recursion, they can try to solve a problem in a different way. It's just sometimes not as elegant. But you have bigger problems with that.
Yeah, we have much bigger problems. I don't know what to replace. I don't think you'd have life, right? That would be the cost.
It's not much.
Otherwise.
Yeah, in language, we talk about it in terms of morphology, which is sort of exactly what we described. It's the ability to get, again, infinite complexity out of a finite system. And without morphology, coming back to Chomsky, we wouldn't have the complexity of human communication that we have. We'd be left at the level of like grunting bears and stuff like that.
And I should say that we wouldn't have life is actually correct. We'd have life-like compartments that form on surfaces, solid surfaces, like deep-sea hydrothermal vents. You get this happening, little bubbles that would have chemical reactions inside of them. But what is key to life is the propagation of self-similar entities and what they contain. So you need to have that to have any kind of life that we can monitor and measure today and be successful and have any kind of phylogeny, evolutionary history. It's all gone if you can't get self-replication. So I think that's what you'd end up with. Hydrothermal vents that have little chemical reactions and little bubbles.
With grunting bears.
Grunting bears.
So this is in the context of biology. My question is, to me, there seems a tension between recursion and finite resources. For example, like I have in my mind the Petri dish and the bacteria growing with finite food resources on that, and they grow in this fractalated manner. What happens when the resources cannot satisfy the propagation? Like, is it just the death of recursion, or is there a recursive solution to that?
Well, I mean, resources are recycled. So I could envision that once the primary resources are exhausted for the primary organism that we're talking about, and I'm a microbial ecologist, so I would invoke the community, then others will feed on those organisms and propagate themselves, and you'd end up with a food web, which would just be a basic ecology class. So I think that would still be consistent, and that's exactly what happens. And finding one organism on the surface of anything ever is very rare. It's basically a human artifact that you'd have a Petri plate with one organism on it. In the environment, it's all food web. It's all exchanging of those finite resources.
My question is, we all agree that these recursively generated pictures are somewhat appealing to us, despite the fact that they are usually created by a simple rule, and other simple pictures seem boring to us. Do you have any ideas why we like some recursive pictures better than the simple boring ones?
Naomi always says, she says, it's the little twist that makes it interesting, right? The little twist. And that's what evolution does. That's what those errors are what makes it kind of interesting, or the changes. But that's fundamentally what I find. It's a great question. Why is it so appealing? Why is recursion so satisfying in a way that kind of is what started this whole process of why do we like it so much? But it really defines so much of our experience as humans that maybe it's just fundamentally human in some ways.
I can maybe make this very specific. So one of the things that I fell in love with on this project was, I can't even move it.
I might have turned it off, actually.
I'm bad at technology today. Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's
fractal art.
Good point.
And when we were trying to come up with poster things, it was literally me sitting at a computer running through different forms of fractal art. And I'm hypnotized by it. You know what I mean? The amount of work that went into this was literally me hitting a randomize button for 20 times until it created something beautiful. But when it created something beautiful, it was hypnotic. Again, I think we're drawn to that sort of complexity, which I mean is a literary thing as well, looking at the complexity of language and how the greatest authors in the world are able to put language together in, again, an intricate and beautiful way. So for me, kind of simplifies by the image a little bit.
So would you say that we have some kind of a feeling that what we see is generated by some simple rules, and that just resonates with us because we're thinking in terms of the same kind of rules?
Maybe.
I would go out on a limb here. This is just me spitballing, but we like some types of music quite a lot, and some have suggested that music simulates human thought. in some ways. So it's like our brain work. We're observing and enjoying our brain as it would work. So I'm wondering if there may be a parallel there, that we work this way fundamentally, and so we see it and we recognize it and we appreciate it. That's
Maybe it's
kind of
narcissism, essentially.
What? Say it again.
We're recursive beings. Maybe it's narcissism. We're drawn to recursion for that reason.
Yes.
Okay, so Professor DeMann, you talked about science, or you described science fiction literature in a recursive way, in that you start out with like reality plus a novum, and then the novum becomes reality, etc. But you never, I don't think you talked about the base case.
The base case shifts. The base case is reality. And then we create something, and in the world of science fiction. And then maybe we make it, maybe we don't. If we don't make it, it doesn't get incorporated into reality. So the process kind of doesn't happen. It's sort of like maybe a dead link on mutation, perhaps. I shouldn't talk about biology because I'm not equipped to do that. Yeah, I think basically that the base case is wherever we are right now. When the author sits down at their computer or typewriter and says, I'm going to start with this reality, and then I'm going to create the novum. Now, I should point out that the novum can be plural. It can be nova. Obviously, you can have a lot of new things in a work of science fiction. But for me, that's where the base case is. It's the world that the author is trying to reflect in terms of the reality component. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so like your base case there is something dynamic that is currently based on like current time.
Unless we go base case is like when Mary Shelley sat down to write Frankenstein. Because that being the first real science fiction. Yeah, pretty much. You're welcome.
Hi. In a sort of future science fiction Gattaca world where we've used CRISPR to do gene modification, when we are choosing ourselves to make changes biologically and making that conscious choice, is that still recursion?
In a fictional world exclusively, you're talking about?
If this was a future world, we're to imagine that world, and we've consciously made a decision to make changes, and those are the changes that humans find normal.
I think if we do that, it has to be handed off to Josh. Then it's biology, right?
Right. So I don't know. That's a nice idea. I think that's very creative. I don't fully know how to answer your question, I think, because I'm not sure I understand.
If humans like
we modify our DNA, right?
Have dominant traits instead of the environment making those changes, still recursion, or is that some sort of internal change?
Where I was seeing recursion interface with biology transcends that scenario. It's propagation, it's the language, the rules that make up the grammar of the DNA, it's the diversification which continues. Evolution doesn't stop in that scenario, and we still have our little nesting dolls within each one of our cells. So I think, yes, it's fully still recursion-based biological entities that we would be at that point. Does that help? Okay.
If there are no more questions, please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers again.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Really great. So tonight's lecture actually marks the end of another successful year of Bridges Lectures. Thanks to all the supporters who came out this year to learn more about the art of perfumery, polar projections, encryption, and enigma machines. And for this evening's presentation about recursion. Thank you also to our committed sponsors at the University of Waterloo, faculties of arts, mathematics, and science, to the Field Institute, and to our hosts here at St. Jerome's University, of course. This collaboration has been the key to such a successful series that's brought amazing speakers from around the world to Waterloo. And finally, a shout out to the Bridges Organizing Committee, Paul Craig from the University of Waterloo, right there, Alicia Colensis from St. Jerome's University Department of English, and Benoit Charbonneau from the University of Waterloo Faculty of Mathematics. And I should say Paul is from the University of Waterloo Faculty of Science. And thank you for your commitment and dedication to the series, always ensuring really unique and interesting topics, and reminding us of the important connections between arts, mathematics, and science. And finally, I urge you to sign up on the email list that's out in the main lobby area. There's a sign-up sheet, and it's at the welcome desk, and this will let you know as early as possible about the 2018-90 Bridges lecture series that resumes in the fall. And actually, the first lecture in the fall will be the 25th Bridges lecture. So we're looking forward to that and all the other great talks to come in the 2018-19 series. Thank you very much for your attention. There is a reception now outside these doors. So thank you again for your attention.
Through that coffee.